Good evening, dear listener. It is August 28th, 2025, and the city of New York exhales another long summer day. The streets shimmer with late heat, and the air carries the murmur of financial unease. Today's headlines speak of a nation balancing between optimism and anxiety. The Labor Department's latest report suggests unemployment creeping higher than expected, with thousands of layoffs announced in the retail sector as companies struggle against weaker consumer demand. At the same time, officials in Washington spar openly about whether the Federal Reserve should move faster to cut interest rates, fearing that hesitation may tip the fragile economy into recession. Investors, meanwhile, cling to screens, watching gold rise, oil slip, and digital assets tremble. It feels new, immediate, pressing. And yet beneath the urgency of today lies an echo from long ago, a rhythm America has played before. For history, in its patient way, tends to rhyme. Nearly 2 centuries earlier, when the nation was still young and the frontier stretched endlessly westward, another bubble swelled in the American imagination. Its fuel was not artificial intelligence, crypto, or speculative stocks, but acres of fertile soil land, the very earth itself. To own land in the 1830s was to believe in fortune, stability, and a future without limits. Deeds passed from hand to hand as if they were lottery tickets. Banks poured out paper credit, and new towns were plotted on maps long before they rose from the prairie. Families who had never seen the frontier bought tracts they would never touch, convinced that the price could only rise. The fever was stoked by politics as much as by dreams. President Andrew Jackson, proud in his distrust of the great bank of the United States, dismantled it and scattered federal funds into smaller pet banks. These banks, flush with deposits, lent freely to anyone willing to speculate. And speculate they did in farms, on towns, on entire futures. Paper promises, multiplied far faster than the crops those acres might one day yield. Confidence, as always, was abundant and it was not. Then came the spring of 1837. The music of speculation stopped, almost without warning. Banks that had once printed promises closed their doors. Merchants found themselves unable to pay suppliers. Families who had stretched to buy land discovered their deeds were worth little more than the paper they were written on. And in the great cities, most painfully in New York, the collapse reached the worker. Factories shuttered, docks fell silent, and men by the thousands wandered in search of wages that no longer existed. It was America's first great financial panic, and it left behind not just numbers and ledgers, but hunger on the streets. Bread lines stretched where ambition once had. The richest soil on earth seemed to have betrayed those who trusted in it most. And yet within this collapse lies a mirror, one that still reflects us now. For every age has its bubble, its fever of speculation, its dream of endless growth. In ours, it may be digital assets, new technologies, or speculative real estate. In Jackson's America, it was land. Both rest on the same fragile foundation, human belief. And when belief falters, the collapse arrives swiftly, as it did in 1837. Tonight, as we step into that past, let us do so not with alarm, but with calm reflection. The panic of 1837 was not merely a tale of numbers, but of people of ambition, despair, and resilience. And though the cycle of boom and bust continues into our own time, the story offers more than caution. It offers perspective. For even after the crash, life did not end. It reshaped, adapted, endured. So let us drift back, together into that world, listening to its lessons with patience. The paper may have burned, the banks may have failed, and the jobs may have vanished. But within the silence of that collapse lies something enduring, an old truth that perhaps, even in 2025, we still need to hear. The panic of 1837 was not a single thunderclap, but a slow storm gathering over a decade, born from ambition, policy, and illusion. To understand its weight, one must picture America in the 1830s, a nation swelling with pride, stretching westward and convinced that prosperity was its natural destiny. Railroads and canals promised to bind the land together, farms seemed endless, and the political spirit of Andrew Jackson infused the age with confidence, even defiance. Ordinary families believed they could grasp wealth simply by reaching toward the horizon. Land was cheap, credit was easy, and the future appeared to belong to anyone bold enough to claim it. But beneath the glow of expansion were cracks. The financial world was precarious, with banks multiplying across states, each printing paper notes backed by promises as fragile as the signatures they bore. Jackson's victory over the great Bank of the United States scattered federal funds into local pet banks, creating a torrent of easy money. Farmers, merchants, and speculators borrowed with abandon, and land values soared. Towns were drawn on maps, as if the frontier could be willed into existence by ink alone. The fever was contagious, infecting both wealthy investors and humble farmers who dreamed of doubling their modest savings. Yet speculation is always a dance on thin ice. By the mid-1830s, warning signs appeared. Crops failed in parts of the nation, reducing incomes just as debts grew heavier. Britain, worried about its own stability, began demanding payments in hard specie gold and silver rather than American paper. As foreign credit dried, American banks found themselves overextended. Then came Jackson's Specie Circular of 1836, requiring that federal land purchases be made only with gold or silver. What seemed like a safeguard, instead, struck like a hammer. Credit collapsed, loans defaulted, and the fragile scaffolding of speculation shivered. When the panic arrived in May 1837, it was merciless. Banks suspended payments, merchants closed their shops, and unemployment spread like a shadow across the cities. In New York, crowds gathered outside shuttered institutions, hoping for answers that never came. Workers who had never speculated on an acre of frontier soil still paid the price, as factories cut wages or closed altogether. The land bubble, inflated by dreams of endless wealth, had burst, and its fragments fell hardest on those least prepared. And yet, within this tale of ruin lies a deeper narrative. The Panic of 1837 was not just about economics. It was about the fragility of belief, the consequences of policy, and the human tendency to chase what glitters just beyond reach. It reminds us that every bubble, whether built on land, railroads, stocks, or digital assets, is less about the object itself than about the confidence people place in it. Once that confidence breaks, the collapse follows swiftly. As we trace the story, we will move through its many layers. The fertile optimism of the early 1830s, the dismantling of the central bank, the wild speculation that turned deeds into dreams, and the brutal crash that left thousands without work. We will hear from politicians who promised stability but delivered chaos, from ordinary citizens who found themselves caught in forces far beyond their control, and from historians who later tried to measure the cost of that panic. Along the way, we will pause to notice how familiar the rhythm feels to us today. For though the instruments may change from land deeds to mortgage-backed securities, from silver coins to digital tokens, the song remains hauntingly the same dot. And so, this story is not merely a relic of the past. It is a mirror, reflecting our own uncertainties in 2025. As America debates inflation, unemployment, and the stability of its financial system, we find ourselves once more asking questions that our ancestors faced nearly 2 centuries ago. How much faith can we place in paper promises? How resilient is the worker when the tide of speculation recedes? And what lessons, if any, have we truly learned? This, then, is the journey ahead, to walk slowly through the world of 1837, to listen to its voices, to feel its panic, and to uncover the threads that bind it to our own restless moment. It is a tale of soil and silver, of banks and breadlines, of policy and human frailty. And if we follow it carefully, perhaps we will not only understand the past more clearly, but glimpse something vital about our own uncertain present. And before we dive deeper, if you find comfort in these quiet journeys through history, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, or sharing a thought in the comments, sir. Support helps keep these stories alive. To step into the America of the early 1830s is to enter a country swollen with confidence, restless with energy, and convinced that destiny itself favored its rise. The frontier seemed infinite. From the Atlantic coast, towns and farms pressed steadily westward into forests, prairies, and valleys that appeared to stretch without end. For ordinary families, land was not just property, was hope, inheritance, and the surest sign of prosperity. In a world before stocks flickered on screens, or cryptocurrencies existed in code, acres of soil were the currency of dreams. The United States had recently emerged from the so-called era of good feelings. But beneath the surface, tensions brewed. Andrew Jackson had entered the White House in 1829 with a mixture of iron will and populist fire. He presented himself as the defender of the common man, the enemy of entrenched elites, and above all, the slayer of the great bank of the United States. Jackson believed that concentrated financial power corrupted democracy, and his battles with Nicholas Biddle, the bank's president, became legendary. Yet while Jackson celebrated his victory over the institution, the consequences of scattering federal funds into smaller pet banks would ripple through the nation. With money suddenly flowing into local banks, credit became abundant. Farmers borrowed to buy land, merchants borrowed to expand shops, and speculators borrowed to gamble on plots they had never seen. Deeds passed across counters like cards in a game of chance. Newspapers printed glowing stories of western towns that barely existed, describing futures as if they were already built. Land offices bustled with activity, and maps became talismans of fortune. A young man in New England could imagine himself rich simply by purchasing a deed to farmland in Ohio or beyond, even if he had no intention of tilling the soil. What made this moment particularly intoxicating was the belief that America's growth was limitless. Cotton, fueled by slave labor in the South, commanded high prices in global markets, feeding the illusion that prosperity would never falter. Canals like the Erie connected markets with astonishing efficiency, while railroads, though still young, promised to stitch together the vast continent. The nation's self-image was of expansion, progress, and inevitability. To own a slice of the frontier was to own a piece of that destiny. But in hindsight, the optimism looks fragile, almost brittle. The very abundance of credit, the eagerness of families to sign loans, and the willingness of banks to print paper money, unbacked by solid reserves, laid the foundation for disaster. Still, at the time, few could imagine collapse. Ordinary citizens trusted that the soil itself could not betray them, that America's march westward was as unstoppable as the seasons. Seen from our vantage point in 2025, the picture feels strangely familiar. Today, the speculation may be in digital assets, housing markets, or the latest wave of technology stocks. But the underlying story is the same. Human beings convincing themselves that growth will never end, that tomorrow will always be richer than today. And just as in the 1830s, easy credit and abundant optimism fuel the climb. In those first years of the decade, the mood of the nation was more than economic, it was cultural. Jackson's America believed it was writing a chapter of exceptional destiny. The soil seemed to reward every hand that touched it, and for many, land was not only wealth, but a moral claim, a right, even a duty. Owning land made one independent, respectable, a participant in the grand democratic experiment. To deny this dream was almost un-American, and so the bubble swelled, carried not merely by numbers and loans, but by imagination, ideology, and a stubborn faith that the earth itself was infinite. What no one yet realized was how quickly that dream could vanish, and how deeply its collapse would wound not just investors, but the very workers who had no stake in speculation. The panic of 1837 was already gathering its clouds, even as the sun of optimism seemed to shine brightest. If the frontier was the dream, Andrew Jackson was the man who gave it both fuel and fire. To his supporters, Jackson was the very embodiment of the self-made American, a boy of modest birth, hardened by war, risen by grit to the highest office of the land. He carried with him a suspicion of privilege and a hatred of concentrated financial power, and nothing embodied those enemies more clearly than the Second Bank of the United States. The bank was, in theory, a stabilizing institution. Chartered by Congress, it was meant to oversee the nation's finances, regulate currency, and provide a measure of restraint on reckless lending. Its president, Nicholas Biddle, believed in discipline, in order, in maintaining the value of paper currency. But to Jackson, the bank was a monster, an elite engine serving the wealthy, suffocating the common man, and corrupting the republic. His language was fierce, populist, and deeply personal. He called it a hydra of corruption and vowed to slay it. The conflict came to a climax in 1832, when Biddle sought to renew the bank's charter early. Congress approved, but Jackson struck back with a veto that thundered with populist rhetoric. He declared that the bank privileged a wealthy few at the expense of the many, that it wielded political influence dangerous to democracy, and that America must not bow to financial aristocracy. His words resonated with farmers and small-town citizens who distrusted distant elites. When Jackson won re-election later that year, it was seen as a public mandate to crush the institution. What followed was one of the most consequential financial maneuvers in American history. Jackson ordered federal deposits withdrawn from the bank and placed into state-chartered institutions, soon nicknamed pet banks. These banks, freed from the discipline of a national regulator, began to lend with astonishing generosity. Credit flowed like water through the economy. Land sales surged, speculation thrived, and paper money multiplied far beyond the nation's reserves of gold and silver. At first, this seemed like prosperity in action. Farmers could borrow to expand their fields, merchants to enlarge their shops, and speculators to gamble on vast tracts of western soil. Newspapers praised the dynamism of Jacksonian democracy, pointing to bustling land offices as proof that wealth was no longer chained to the old Eastern elite. To ordinary Americans, Jackson appeared to have delivered on his promise. Power had been wrestled from the hands of a financial monster and placed back into the pockets of the people. But beneath the cheers, danger lurked. Without the restraint of a central institution, the system became fragile, unpredictable, and dangerously inflated. The pet banks printed notes, as though prosperity could be conjured by paper alone. Many issued far more credit than they could ever redeem in gold or silver. Farmers who borrowed believed their harvests would cover the debt. Merchants trusted in endless demand, and speculators assumed land would always rise in value. Each acted rationally within the fever, but collectively they built a tower that could not stand. It is easy, from our vantage in 2025, to draw a parallel. When regulators loosen rules, when markets are flooded with liquidity, when optimism runs unchecked, growth looks miraculous till the ground beneath it shifts. We have seen versions of this with mortgage-backed securities in 2008, with crypto in recent years, and with speculative technology stocks that surge on promises rather than profits. Jackson's dismantling of the Bank of the United States was not just a political triumph. It was the opening act in a drama of boom and bust. The irony is striking. Jackson saw himself as a champion of the common man, defending ordinary Americans from the grip of elites, and yet, by scattering funds into pet banks and unleashing unregulated credit, he laid the very trap that would soon ensnare those same ordinary Americans. The farmer in Ohio, the dockworker in New York, the shopkeeper in Boston all would eventually feel the sting of collapse. For the moment, though, in the early 1830s, the music was still playing. Land deeds sold at dizzying prices, towns were planned with optimism, and newspapers declared a new age of prosperity. The Hydra had been slain, and the people cheered. What they did not realize was that in killing the monster, they had also unchained a chaos of their own making. The land boom of the 1830s did not spread quietly. It roared across the nation like a fever. At its heart was a simple conviction: land equaled wealth. From the crowded streets of New York to the frontier edges of Ohio, Kentucky, and beyond, men and women believed that owning acres of soil was the surest way to secure fortune. For some, it was survival. For others, it was a gamble. For many, it was both. Government land offices became the stage of this frenzy. In towns like Huntsville, Alabama, or Springfield, Illinois, the scene was often chaotic. Lines of hopeful buyers stretched out the doors, each man clutching the dream of claiming a piece of the frontier. Deeds and titles were written with hurried pens, sometimes for plots that no one had ever set foot on. In speculative markets, parcels were bought and sold multiple times before anyone even traveled to see the land itself. The idea of ownership carried more weight than the land's reality. Stories from the period tell of clerks in land offices, nearly drowning in paperwork, stacks of deeds and maps piled so high they toppled over desks. Small farmers mortgaged what little they had in order to purchase new acreage, trusting that rising prices would cover their debts. Shopkeepers, eager to ride the wave, invested their profits in distant tracts, convinced that flipping land would secure their children's futures. Even schoolteachers and widows, urged on by neighbors or local papers, put savings into speculative plots, hoping to double or triple their modest funds. The hunger for land was fueled by credit as much as by hope. Pet banks, flush with government deposits, issued loans freely. A farmer with little more than a handshake could secure the money needed to buy acres hundreds of miles away. The cycle fed upon itself. More loans created more land sales, which drove up prices, which in turn justified more borrowing. In the logic of the moment, the boom could never end, but reality was never far away. Letters survive from cautious observers who saw the madness unfolding. Some warned that too many towns existed only on maps, that too many deeds were signed for soil that could not support farms. One historian writing later noted that whole paper cities were bought and sold, as if wealth could be conjured by ink alone. And yet in the excitement of the moment, such warnings were drowned by the noise of speculation. The fever also reshaped the culture of aspiration. To own land became not merely a financial choice, but a marker of status, independence, and citizenship. In the American imagination, land was tied to virtue itself. Newspapers told stories of poor men who became prosperous through bold purchases. Ministers spoke of land as God's blessing, a resource meant to be claimed. Politicians wrapped expansion in the language of democracy and opportunity. To question the land boom was, in some communities, to question the American dream. Of course, the frenzy carried its own dark comedy. Tales circulated of men selling the same tract of land to 3 or 4 buyers, each convinced he held the rightful deed. Others invested in swampland that could never be drained, or in rocky hillsides that could never grow a crop. But optimism was so strong that even these obvious flaws were brushed aside. Just as in later centuries investors would pour fortunes into doomed railroads or speculative tech companies, so too did Americans of the 1830s convince themselves that no price was too high for soil. And perhaps that is the most human detail of all. The belief that one can outsmart the cycle, that this time will be different. Families mortgaged homes, shopkeepers emptied savings, and communities placed their futures in land that sometimes existed only in their imagination. Looking back from 2025, the pattern feels strikingly familiar. Today, it is not swampland in Illinois but overpriced condos in overheated markets, or digital assets traded at midnight on glowing screens. The faces change, the instruments evolve, but the fever remains the same. We tell ourselves that growth is permanent, that risk is only for others, that we can ride the wave forever. And then, as in 1837, the wave collapses. The land boom of the 1830s was not just an economic bubble, it was a cultural event, a collective leap of faith into soil and speculation. And like all such leaps, it carried the certainty of a fall. By the middle of the 1830s, the great American land boom began to show its first cracks, though many refused to notice them. Like all bubbles, it was a world built upon confidence, and confidence has a way of silencing inconvenient truths. But if one looked closely, the warning signs were clear. The most obvious strain came from agriculture itself. Harvests, which should have underpinned the loans of farmers and the promises of banks, began to falter in certain regions. Wheat yields in parts of the Midwest disappointed, and cotton, the great export crop of the South, showed troubling fluctuations. When Britain, the key buyer of American cotton, reduced its imports and tightened credit in response to its own financial worries, the cracks in the American edifice widened. Suddenly, there was less hard money, gold and silver flowing back. Across the Atlantic, American banks, which had flooded the economy with paper promises, began to feel the pressure of redemption. To make matters worse, the frenzy of speculation had carried people far beyond their means. Pet banks had printed notes with reckless confidence, and loans were often issued without the slightest guarantee of repayment. Ordinary citizens, who had mortgaged everything for a chance at frontier wealth, now discovered that their paper deeds were only valuable so long as others believed in them. Once confidence faltered, those deeds would be little more than ink. Amid this growing unease, President Andrew Jackson issued what would prove to be a fateful decree, the Specie Circular of July 1836. This order required that purchases of federal land be made only with hard money, gold, or silver coins rather than paper notes. Jackson, ever suspicious of banks and their paper promises, believed he was protecting the nation from reckless speculation. He saw specie as the only honest currency, the one tethered to real value. But while the intention was stability, the effect was shock. The specie circular abruptly pulled the rug out from under the feverish land market. Those who had relied on paper banknotes suddenly found themselves unable to buy federal land. Demand for gold and silver skyrocketed, draining specie from banks that had already issued far more notes than they could back. It was as if Jackson had declared that the nation must suddenly pay in coin for a dream it had been financing with promises. The consequences rippled quickly. Land sales plummeted. Banks, desperate to maintain specie reserves, began tightening credit and calling in loans. Merchants, who had expanded recklessly on borrowed funds, found themselves squeezed. Farmers, already strained by weak harvests and falling cotton prices, were forced to sell assets or default. The fragile scaffolding of speculation, already weakened by international pressures, now buckled under the weight of Jackson's decree. Historians have debated whether the specie circular was the match that lit the fire, or simply the gust of wind that revealed the flames already burning. Some argue that speculation would have collapsed regardless, that the nation's credit system was too fragile and too overextended to survive. Others see Jackson's order as a decisive blow, a sudden tightening of liquidity that turned a bubble into a panic. What is certain is that confidence, the most precious currency of all, began to erode. From the perspective of 2025, the episode feels almost painfully familiar. When central banks today raise interest rates or tighten liquidity, markets often convulse and panic, not because the assets themselves have changed, but because the rules of the game suddenly shift. In the 1830s, Jackson's Specie Circular played that role. What had once seemed limitless was revealed to be fragile. What had once been promises became paper. And yet, in the moment, many Americans still clung to optimism. They told themselves that the fever might pass, that credit might return, that land would surely rise in value again. Denial, too, is a constant of bubbles. But the storm was already gathering, and in a matter of months, the dream of endless growth would collapse into the harsh reality of panic. The storm finally broke in May 1837. It began, as such things often do, in whispers around New York's financial district, rumors of banks unable to meet obligations, of merchants defaulting on debts, of specie reserves running dry. Then came the confirmation. One by one, major banks in New York suspended payment in gold and silver, admitting that they could not redeem the mountain of paper notes they had issued. To ordinary depositors, it was a stunning betrayal. The very institutions that had promised stability now confessed insolvency. Panic spread quickly. Crowds gathered outside banks, pressing for answers, some pleading for access to savings that no longer existed. Merchants shuttered their shops, unable to pay suppliers. Factories laid off workers. Docks fell eerily silent, and thousands of laborers suddenly found themselves without wages. The land bubble, inflated by optimism and credit, had burst, and its shockwaves rippled far beyond the speculators who had fueled it. The crisis struck hardest at those who had never gambled at all. Contemporary accounts describe New York in those weeks as a city transformed. Breadlines stretched down streets, once busy with commerce. Families sold furniture or clothing to buy food. Newspapers, which only months before had celebrated boundless prosperity, now printed grim tallies of bankruptcies. One report estimated that by summer, more than one-third of the city's workers were unemployed. Men who had once imagined owning acres of farmland now struggled simply to keep a roof overhead. The panic did not remain confined to the financial elite. In towns and villages across the young republic, the effects were just as brutal. Farmers, unable to pay debts, lost land to foreclosure. Small-town banks collapsed, wiping out the savings of families who had trusted them. The dream of easy wealth through land ownership turned, almost overnight, into a nightmare of dispossession. And yet, as devastating as it was, the panic of 1837 revealed a truth that history has repeated time and again. That speculative booms collapse not only under their own weight, but also upon the backs of the most vulnerable. The worker who never speculated, the family who never borrowed recklessly, the farmer who tilled honestly all were caught in the wreckage of a system built on overconfidence. Seen from 2025, the parallels are sobering. In our own time, sudden shifts in policy, credit, or global demand can bring similar cascades of unemployment and hardship. The instruments have changed. Cryptocurrency crashes, housing busts, stocks are lost, but the human cost remains remarkably consistent. Every collapse has its breadlines, its jobless crowds, its hollowed streets, and every collapse carries the same lesson. The promises of endless growth are only as solid as the confidence behind them. For the young republic of the 1830s, that confidence was shattered. The streets of New York echoed with the silence of idle workers, and the nation entered one of its first Great Depressions. Optimism, once so intoxicating, had vanished, replaced by the sober realization that prosperity was fragile, and that speculation exacts its price. And so part one of our story closes on a somber note. The bubble had burst. The panic had arrived, and the wave of unemployment had swept across America. Yet even within despair, history leaves us with questions, lessons, and glimpses of resilience. If you're still awake with me at this point, perhaps you can leave a simple one in the comments. It's our quiet signal, a way of knowing you are here, listening, keeping the thread alive across centuries. In the immediate aftermath of the crash of 1837, the United States was not only plunged into economic turmoil, but also into a storm of political accusation. Financial ruin always demands an explanation, and in the fevered climate of Jacksonian America, blame was both a weapon and a shield. The public, bewildered by the sudden collapse, looked to leaders for answers, and leaders ever mindful of survival were quick to provide them. Andrew Jackson, though retired from the presidency, loomed large in the debate. To his supporters, the panic was the fault of foreign pressures, of Britain tightening credit and demanding payment in gold and silver, of harvest failures beyond America's control. To his critics, however, the seeds of collapse were planted by Jackson himself. In his war against the Bank of the United States and his reckless specie circular, they argued that by scattering federal funds into pet banks, he had unleashed chaos. By demanding land be bought with specie, he had drained the economy of liquidity. Jackson, once hailed as the champion of the common man, now stood accused of engineering the very ruin that afflicted that man. His successor, Martin Van Buren, inherited not only the presidency, but also the tempest. A shrewd politician with a gift for organization, Van Buren nonetheless found himself helpless before the scale of the crisis. His first months in office were marked by waves of bankruptcies and soaring unemployment. Crowds gathered not only outside shuttered banks, but also outside the White House, demanding relief. Yet Van Buren, a believer in limited government, resisted calls for direct intervention. He insisted that the federal government could not and should not rescue banks or individuals, for to do so would set a dangerous precedent. The economy, he believed, must correct itself. This refusal was deeply unpopular. Newspapers railed against the administration, accusing it of cold indifference to the suffering of ordinary Americans. Political opponents seized the opportunity, portraying Van Buren as aloof, aristocratic, and out of touch. Satirical cartoons depicted him sipping fine wine while the people starved. To the unemployed worker in New York, or the farmer losing his land in Ohio, the president's restraint felt less like principle and more like abandonment. The social mood darkened. Riots flared in New York, where angry crowds targeted flour merchants, accusing them of hoarding grain and driving up prices. In some cities, mobs stormed warehouses or markets, demanding food at fair cost. Public order, fragile in the best of times, now wavered. Families who had once dreamed of frontier wealth now dreamed only of bread, and their fury sought an outlet. The crisis also deepened divisions between regions. The South, tied to cotton exports, blamed Britain and foreign bankers. The North, with its factories and merchants, pointed to reckless speculation and Jacksonian policy. Western settlers, who had once celebrated the flow of credit, now cursed the system that left them burdened with worthless deeds. In every corner of the Republic, Americans searched for culprits, and in doing so revealed how fragile the Union's sense of common purpose could be. From a distance of nearly 2 centuries, the political theater of 1837 feels familiar. In our own time, when markets stumble and jobs vanish, politicians turn quickly to blame, pointing across oceans, across aisles, across generations. The names change: foreign lenders, Wall Street bankers, central bankers, but the chorus is the same. The public, hungry for certainty, accepts the simplest explanation, even when the truth is tangled and complex. For Van Buren, the cost was heavy. His presidency, born in the shadow of Jackson's triumphs, became defined by economic misery. He would forever be remembered, fairly or not, as the steward of ruin. And yet, within the hardship of 1837 lay the seeds of new debates about the role of government in times of crisis, debates that still echo in the chambers of Congress today. The panic had stripped away illusions. No longer could America believe that land alone was destiny, that speculation was harmless, or that government stood apart from economic storms. The people demanded answers, and though those answers differed, one fact was certain. The Panic of 1837 had become not just an economic event, but a political reckoning. The collapse of 1837 was not simply a matter of banks and policies. It was lived most acutely in kitchens, in workshops, and on the streets. For ordinary Americans, the panic arrived not as an abstract financial crisis, but as an empty pantry, a shuttered factory, or a long line outside a bakery. The wave of unemployment was merciless, rolling through the great cities first, and then rippling outward into smaller towns and villages. In New York, where commerce had once pulsed with restless energy, silence fell on the docks as trade slowed to a crawl. Ships lay idle, their sails furled, their cargoes unsold. Workers who had relied on daily wages suddenly found themselves without purpose, wandering the streets in search of jobs that no longer existed. Bread lines hastily organized by churches or charities became daily rituals. Contemporary accounts describe men queuing in coats patched with rags, women clutching children as they waited for loaves, and volunteers overwhelmed by the sheer volume of need. One letter from a laborer, preserved in the archives of the New York Historical Society, spoke with devastating simplicity. "I have walked the streets these 3 days without work. My children cry for bread. I have sold my tools, and still we hunger. Tell me, is this freedom?" Such voices remind us that behind the statistics of unemployment were lives unraveling thread by thread. Desperation sometimes gave way to anger. In February 1837, before the full collapse, a riot broke out in New York when flour prices spiked dramatically. Crowds stormed warehouses, accusing merchants of hoarding grain. Windows were smashed, barrels overturned, and the police struggled to restore order. Similar disturbances followed the panic itself, as frustration boiled over. The language of politics blame, cast on Jackson, on Van Buren, on British bankers, was meaningful to newspapers. But for the hungry crowd in the street, the only enemy that mattered was the empty table. The countryside was not spared. Farmers, who had mortgaged their land during the boom, faced foreclosure when they could no longer pay. Families abandoned homesteads, moving to towns in search of work that was itself vanishing. Some letters from frontier communities speak of whole neighborhoods hollowed out, of neighbors departing in the night to escape debts. The dream of expansion had turned cruel, leaving behind ghost farms and paper deeds of no worth. Yet amid the hardship, there were glimpses of resilience. Communities organized mutual aid societies, pooling what little resources they had to support the destitute. Churches expanded their charitable missions, feeding hundreds daily. Newspapers, while often grim, occasionally carried stories of neighbors helping one another, shopkeepers extending credit to hungry families, or farmers sharing surplus grain with the unemployed. These small acts did not erase the crisis, but they softened its edges. The personal writings of the time also reveal a quiet dignity. Diaries kept by school teachers, seamstresses, and clerks record the monotony of hunger, but also the determination to endure. One young woman wrote, "We eat less each day, yet still, we gather to sing in the evening. It is the only comfort." Such fragments capture not only despair, but also the stubborn spirit that carried families through long months of uncertainty. Looking back from 2025, the parallels once more strike uncomfortably close. When layoffs sweep modern industries, when bread lines reappear in the form of food banks, when public anger spills into protests. We are seeing echoes of 1837. The faces differ, the causes shift. But the human experience, fear, anger, resilience, remains constant. The Panic of 1837 is not only a chapter in economic history, but also a testimony to how ordinary people bear the weight of extraordinary failures. By the end of that first summer of panic, it was estimated that nearly 500,000 Americans were unemployed, a staggering number for a nation still relatively small. To walk the streets of New York or Philadelphia then was to hear the echo of empty footsteps, to see men waiting at docks where no ships came, to pass homes where mothers stretched meals thinner and thinner. The Republic had learned that prosperity, once taken for granted, could vanish like mist. And yet, even as hardship deepened, the people endured. Some migrated west again, chasing fresh beginnings. Others reinvented trades, or clung stubbornly to shrinking businesses. Many simply waited, surviving one day at a time. It was not a glamorous endurance, nor one celebrated in monuments, but it was reland. In its quiet persistence lay the seed of recovery that would in time return. The Panic of 1837 was not contained within America's borders. Like every financial storm, its winds blew outward, tugging at the cords of international trade. At the heart of this entanglement lay cotton. In the 1830s, cotton was the lifeblood of the American South and the single most important export of the United States. It flowed across the Atlantic in vast quantities, feeding the mills of Manchester and fueling Britain's industrial revolution. Cotton, more than any other crop, was the collateral upon which America's prosperity rested. When Britain tightened credit in the mid-1830s, demanding payment in gold and silver rather than in American paper promises, the fragile system trembled. British banks, wary of speculative excess abroad and nervous about their own reserves, began recalling loans and restricting credit. This action, seemingly distant in London boardrooms, struck directly at the heart of American commerce. Cotton planters who relied on British demand found their prices falling. Merchants in New York who facilitated transatlantic trade discovered their lines of credit evaporating. The great chain that linked southern fields to northern docks to European markets began to snap. The collapse revealed how dependent America had become on international confidence. Speculators at home might have believed that the frontier was endless, but the reality was that the prosperity of the Republic rested on the willingness of foreign buyers and lenders to sustain it. When that willingness faltered, the scaffolding of growth gave way. The domino effect was brutal. With cotton prices plunging, Southern planters could not repay debts owed to local banks. Those banks, already stretched thin by reckless lending, began to collapse. In turn, Northern merchants who relied on Southern cotton shipments lost revenue, leading to layoffs and bankruptcies in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. The failure of one sector cascaded into many others: shipping, insurance, manufacturing, until nearly every corner of the economy felt the sting. Letters from the period describe ships anchored in harbor, unable to sail because financing had collapsed. Warehouses filled with goods that could not be sold abroad. Factories stood idle as orders vanished. What had seemed like a localized panic in New York quickly revealed itself to be a national calamity, tied inseparably to the fortunes of the wider world. The effect reached even further. International investors, wary of American instability, withdrew funds from canal and railroad projects. These grand symbols of progress, the Erie Canal, the budding railroads stitching east to west, suddenly found themselves short of capital. Projects stalled, workers were dismissed, and the sense of unstoppable progress that had defined the early 1830s dimmed, almost overnight. The historian Charles Sellers later described the Panic of 1837 as America's first Great Depression, and the phrase is not without weight. The downturn was not a mere hiccup. It was a grinding malaise that lasted for years, marked by repeated waves of unemployment, bankruptcies, and failed businesses. By some estimates, nearly half of America's banks collapsed in the years following the panic. A staggering testimony to the fragility of the financial system. From the vantage of 2025, the international echoes of 1837 resonate sharply. We, too, live in an economy where no nation stands alone, where supply chains stretch across oceans, and where the tremor of a decision in London, Beijing, or Frankfurt can ripple swiftly to New York. Just as Britain's demand for specie once toppled American confidence, today global markets respond instantly to interest rate decisions or currency shifts abroad. The lesson is timeless. Economic prosperity, however proudly claimed as national, is always intertwined with the currents of the wider world. For ordinary Americans of the 1830s, such global forces were invisible. They knew only that jobs vanished, credit disappeared, and prices fluctuated wildly. Few understood that British bankers or foreign creditors had played a role. To them, the crisis was lived locally in the fields, in the shops, in the cold homes where children went hungry. But beneath those daily struggles, the truth was undeniable. The Panic of 1837 was not just an American story. It was part of a larger web of commerce, confidence, and collapse, linking the young republic to the fate of nations across the Atlantic. By the end of that first year, the optimism that had once defined the age was gone. The land boom was broken, the banks were crippled, and America found itself not only poorer, but also humbled, reminded that its destiny, no matter how grandly imagined, was tethered to forces beyond its control. If the crash of 1837 was a thunderclap, the years that followed were the long, drenching storm. The immediate panic bank runs riots, and shuttered shops gave way to something slower, but no less devastating. A grinding depression that lingered well into the 1840s. For ordinary Americans, this meant not simply a sudden loss, but years of hardship, adaptation, and endurance. Unemployment remained painfully high. In the city's factories that had once churned with activity operated only intermittently, if at all. Those who had been laid off in the spring of 1837 often found no work, even by the winter of 1838. Some men hired themselves out by the day, waiting on street corners in hopes of carrying cargo or sweeping docks. But competition was fierce, and wages were miserably low. Families survived on patchwork incomes, a son selling newspapers, a daughter sewing garments, a mother taking in laundry. The promise of upward mobility that had defined the 1830s now felt like a cruel joke. Hunger became a constant shadow. Reports from charitable organizations speak of thousands seeking bread each week. In some neighborhoods of New York and Philadelphia, soup kitchens fed long lines of the unemployed, a sight that became so common it scarcely merited mention in the press after the first year. Malnutrition, though rarely measured in statistics, haunted poorer families. Diaries and letters describe parents skipping meals so children could eat, or stretching a loaf of bread across several days. In rural communities, the suffering took a different form. Farmers who had mortgaged land during the boom often lost it to foreclosure, creating a class of displaced families with nowhere to go. Some moved west in search of fresh beginnings, only to find that opportunities were scarce, and land less generous than maps had promised. Others drifted into towns, swelling the ranks of the urban unemployed. The frontier, once imagined as a limitless horizon of opportunity, now seemed to swallow as many dreams as it created. Yet amid despair, communities adapted in remarkable ways. Churches expanded their charitable missions, not only feeding the hungry, but also organizing communal work projects. Mutual aid societies, often run by immigrants or labor groups, pooled resources to pay rents or purchase food for members. Neighbors relied on barter more heavily than before, trading goods, services, even promises of future repayment. A carpenter might mend a neighbor's roof in exchange for a few sacks of flour. A seamstress might patch clothes in exchange for firewood. The crisis forced Americans back toward older, communal forms of survival. The Depression also reshaped politics and culture. Newspapers carried daily debates about the proper role of government in times of economic collapse. Some demanded relief programs and public works, while others insisted that hardship was part of the natural economic cycle. Van Buren's insistence on limited government infuriated many, but it also gave rise to new questions about federal responsibility for the welfare of its people. Labor movements, though still in their infancy, drew strength from the shared misery of unemployment. Meetings of workers became more common, and the idea that wage laborers might deserve collective rights gained traction in the shadow of the crisis. There were also more subtle cultural shifts. The optimism of the early 1830s, when speculation seemed patriotic and land was destiny, gave way to a more sober mood. Literature and sermons began to emphasize caution, humility, and moral restraint. Ministers thundered that the panic was a divine punishment for greed and excess. Parents taught their children to be wary of debt, to mistrust easy promises. The scars of 1837 ran deep, shaping a generation's attitudes toward money, risk, and ambition. Looking from 2025, the persistence of hardship feels hauntingly familiar. When modern recessions strike, the immediate panic often dominates headlines. But the slower grind, the years of joblessness, of lost savings, of communities adapting to scarcities, what leaves lasting marks. In both ages, it is not only the numbers on balance sheets but the rhythms of daily life that change. How meals are shared, how neighbors depend on one another, how children grow up with quieter dreams. The long depression that followed the panic of 1837 did not erase the Republic, but it altered its texture. It reminded Americans that prosperity was fragile, that survival often depended not on government or banks, but on one another. And though recovery would eventually come, the memory of hunger, of eviction, of long lines at soup kitchens lingered. In the cultural memory, in the silence of those years, the United States learned not only the cost of speculation, but also the quiet resilience of its people. If the panic of 1837 devastated households and communities, it also reconfigured the political map of the United States. Crises always exposed the limits of leadership, and for Martin Van Buren, who had inherited both Andrew Jackson's mantle and his mess, the panic became the defining test of his presidency, and one that would ultimately undo him. Van Buren entered office in March 1837 with a reputation as a clever politician, a master of party organization, and a loyal lieutenant of Jackson. But cleverness in elections is not the same as authority in crisis. Within weeks of his inauguration, the nation's financial system collapsed, and the new president was cast not as a hero, but as the steward of ruin. His refusal to intervene directly in the economy, born of a philosophy of limited government, was, in principle, consistent with Jacksonian democracy. In practice, it appeared heartless. To the unemployed worker, staring at an empty hearth, Van Buren's speeches about the dangers of government overreach sounded like cruel abstractions. The president did attempt reforms. His most notable initiative was the independent treasury plan, which sought to separate federal funds from private banks altogether, placing them in government vaults. This, he argued, would protect public money from the recklessness of bankers. Yet the proposal satisfied almost no one. Democrats were divided, business interests opposed it, and ordinary citizens saw no relief in it. The independent treasury was a long-term structural reform, but in the short term, it did nothing to put bread on the table. Politically, the damage was swift. The Whig Party, a coalition of Jackson's enemies, seized the moment with relish. They portrayed Van Buren as aristocratic and indifferent, dubbing him Martin van Ruin. Satirical prints showed him elegantly dressed, sipping wine, while the people starved outside. Newspapers ran caricatures of the president living in luxury while his citizens begged for bread. The imagery stuck, and for many Americans, the association between Van Buren and the panic became permanent. By the election of 1840, the Whigs had perfected their message. They put forward William Henry Harrison, presenting him as a man of the people, the hero of Tippecanoe, who lived humbly in a log cabin and drank hard cider. The image was largely contrived. Harrison was wealthy and well-connected, but it resonated powerfully against the backdrop of Van Buren's perceived aloofness. The campaign became one of the most populist in American history, filled with parades, songs, and slogans. Tippecanoe and Tyler, too, rang across the nation, a cheerful anthem of change. Van Buren, despite his political skill, could not escape the shadow of 1837. The Depression lingered. Unemployment remained high, and voters were eager to punish the man they held responsible. In one of the most lopsided defeats of the era, Van Buren lost to Harrison, and the Whigs celebrated their first real triumph on the national stage. The panic had not only toppled fortunes, it had toppled a presidency. The broader consequences for American politics were profound. The crisis deepened debates about the role of government in economic life. Should Washington intervene to stabilize banks, provide relief to the unemployed, or stimulate recovery? Or should it, as Van Buren argued, allow the market to heal itself, however painful the process? These questions, raised sharply in the late 1830s, would echo through future crises: the Civil War, inflation, the depressions of the 1870s and 1890s, the Great Depression of the 1930s, and even into the recessions of our own time. From the vantage point of 2025, the story carries a familiar rhythm. Leaders are often praised in prosperity and blamed in collapse, regardless of their actual culpability. Economic crises create opportunities for opposition parties, for slogans, for imagery that reshapes public perception. In this sense, the Panic of 1837 was not just an economic downturn, but a political realignment. Proof that financial storms can redraw the map of power as surely as they empty bank accounts. And yet, even amid the fury of politics, the human dimension remained. Families struggling to eat cared little for debates over the independent treasury or the philosophy of limited government. They judged their leaders by the simplest measure: were they better off or worse? For Van Buren, the answer was clear, and history recorded his fall. The Panic of 1837, then, was more than a collapse of land, speculation, or credit. It was a crucible in which the young republic tested the resilience of its politics, its people, and its leaders. Some emerged hardened, others broken, but the cycle of hope, collapse, and renewal continued. And if you're still with me, listening to these echoes of long-ago debates and crises, leave a quiet one in the comments. It's our small reminder that even across centuries, the story of past struggles still finds its listeners today. To understand the true weight of the Panic of 1837, one must step away from banks and politics, and instead walk into the kitchens, markets, and streets of everyday America. For it was in daily life that the Depression carved its deepest marks, reshaping the rhythms of families, the diets of workers, and the very culture of survival. The most immediate impact was felt in food. Flour, the staple of the American diet, soared in price. In New York, the cost of a barrel of flour nearly doubled within months of the panic. And for a family living on meager wages, or no wages at all, that difference meant hunger. Riots broke out in February 1837, when desperate crowds stormed flour warehouses, convinced merchants were hoarding grain. Similar unrest simmered in other cities as bread, once taken for granted, became a daily struggle. Meat, butter, and coffee grew. scarce luxuries, while many families substituted with cheaper staples like cornmeal or potatoes. Letters from the time describe meals shrinking. One loaf stretched over 3 days, meat eaten only on Sundays. Coffee replaced by weak substitutes brewed from roasted chicory. Clothing, too, reflected the downturn. In diaries and letters, one finds references to coats patched repeatedly, shoes repaired until they could no longer be worn, and families sharing garments between siblings. Tailors and seamstresses saw business decline, not because people had no need of clothing, but because they had no money to pay. Even in middle-class households, appearances became humbler. Fashion, once a marker of rising prosperity, gave way to practicality and austerity. Housing posed another burden. With wages scarce, rents became difficult to meet. Evictions were common, and in cities, entire blocks saw families forced out. Some moved in with relatives, others took in boarders, renting out a corner of a room for survival. Boarding houses, once the domain of traveling salesmen or young apprentices, now swelled with entire families living in cramped quarters. Privacy, comfort, and stability gave way to crowding and improvisation. The Depression also reshaped work. In better times, a skilled artisan might have enjoyed steady demand: shoemakers, carpenters, blacksmiths, printers. But when money dried up, so too did commissions. Many artisans found themselves competing for odd jobs far beneath their training, while others abandoned trades altogether to work as casual laborers. Journeymen's associations and early labor groups recorded bitter meetings where members lamented the loss of dignity and stability. Yet culture adapts even in crisis. Churches became central not only for worship, but also for survival, organizing, food distribution, clothing drives, and community meals. Hymns and sermons increasingly focused on endurance and humility, offering solace to congregations battered by want. Music and storytelling in the home took on new importance as entertainment, cheap enough for all. A father's fiddle, a mother's song, or a neighbor's tale became the evening's diversion, a brief escape from the weight of hunger. Schools, too, felt the pinch. Some families withdrew children to save on fees, or to put them to work contributing income. Reports tell of young boys selling newspapers or shining shoes, while girls took in sewing or laundry. Childhood, for many, grew shorter, its freedoms narrowed by the demands of survival. Still, there was resilience. Communities invented systems of barter: flour traded for labor, firewood for mending, potatoes for carpentry, hard times tokens, unofficial coins minted by private businesses, circulated in place of scarce official currency, often stamped with biting slogans, mocking Van Buren, or celebrating hard cider. These small copper pieces were more than currency. They were symbols of a society improvising to survive. Seen from 2025, the texture of life in the late 1830s feels both distant and familiar. Today, when inflation makes groceries dearer, when housing grows unaffordable, when families cut luxuries to make ends meet, we echo the same patterns. We may no longer riot for flour, but food banks grow crowded. We may not patch coats endlessly, but we stretch paychecks in quieter ways. Crisis reshapes daily life, less with drama than with monotony. Meal by meal, bill by bill. Day by day, for Americans living through the aftermath of 1837. Survival was not a headline but a habit, stitched into every choice. Their story is not only one of suffering, but of endurance, of families who stretched, communities who shared, and individuals who found dignity in the smallest victories. The panic of 1837 fell hardest not on the wealthy speculators, who had gambled in acres of frontier land, but on those with the fewest defenses, the immigrants and the poor who crowded America's port cities. For them, the Depression was not simply a loss of fortune, it was the collapse of fragile footholds in a new world. New, York, already swelling with newcomers from Ireland, Germany, and beyond, became a crucible of hardship. Immigrants arrived daily at the docks, some clutching letters promising work, others carrying nothing but hope. But the timing was cruel. Instead of opportunity, many found only shuttered warehouses and factories running at half capacity. Jobs that had once been abundant for dock workers, seamstresses, and laborers vanished, leaving thousands adrift in a city already strained. The Irish, fleeing poverty and instability at home, were particularly vulnerable. Many had settled in the city's poorest districts, living in cellars and overcrowded tenements. When unemployment spread, they were often the first dismissed and the last rehired. Contemporary observers wrote of entire Irish families surviving on little more than potatoes, sometimes for weeks at a time. Cholera and typhus, bred in cramped conditions, stalked these neighborhoods, turning economic crisis into a public health disaster. German immigrants, though often more skilled, fared little better. Artisans, such as shoemakers, cabinet, and brewers saw demand for their trades collapse. Proud of their craft traditions, many were forced into day labor, carrying cargo or digging ditches simply to feed their families. Letters sent back to Europe tell a stark tale, dreams of prosperity replaced by warnings to others not to follow. The city's native poor fared no better. African American workers, already facing discrimination, were among the most severely affected, denied access to many trades, and facing competition from desperate white laborers. They often found themselves excluded from relief efforts or forced into the lowest paying jobs. Riots sometimes turned their anger against them, making hardship even more dangerous. Charities and churches stepped in where they could. Catholic parishes fed the hungry Irish. German societies pooled funds to support unemployed members. African American congregations organized mutual aid. These efforts provided lifelines, but the scale of need was overwhelming. Newspapers of the time described endless queues outside soup kitchens, where men and women waited for thin broth served from iron pots. Some families moved nightly from shelter to shelter, never certain where the next meal would come from. The panic also deepened tensions between communities. Nativist voices grew louder, blaming immigrants for taking scarce jobs or driving down wages. Foreign paupers, some editorials sneered, as though the newcomers were the cause of the nation's misery rather than its victims. In turn, immigrant communities tightened their bonds, clinging to language, faith, and custom as shields against both poverty and prejudice. Yet resilience thrived even here. The Irish built networks of support that would later fuel their rise. In city politics, German immigrants founded cultural and educational societies that preserved identity while adapting to American life. African Americans, despite relentless obstacles, expanded churches and schools that anchored their communities. The very pressure of the Depression forced solidarity, teaching groups to rely on one another in ways that would echo for generations. The parallels to 2025 are difficult to miss. Today, immigrants still arrive in America chasing opportunity, only to confront cycles of economic downturn that test their hopes. Recessions strike the vulnerable first, those with the weakest safety nets, the least savings, the most precarious. Work, the faces may differ, but the rhythm is the same. The crowded tenement of 1837 becomes the crowded apartment of today. The soup kitchen becomes the food bank. The prejudice remains, and so too does the resilience. For the immigrants of the 1830s, survival often meant compromise, accepting lower wages, enduring harsher conditions, postponing dreams. But it also meant carving out spaces of strength, building the foundations of communities that, in time, would flourish, though the panic of 1837 threatened to crush them. It also revealed the stubborn endurance that defines the immigrant story in America. By the early 1840s, many who had arrived destitute in the depths of depression began slowly to find footing. Again, the path was longer, harsher, and far less golden than promised, but they endured. And in their endurance, they left a legacy that still shapes the fabric of American cities. The Panic of 1837 did not only close banks and bankrupt merchants, it reshaped the very structure of work in America. In the years that followed, the market for labor became more fragile, more precarious, and in many ways more modern. As workers discovered both their vulnerability and the faint beginnings of collective strength for skilled artisans, shoemakers, carpenters, printers, blacksmiths, the Depression was particularly cruel. Before the Panic, many had lived with a measure of security, their trades respected, their wages relatively steady. But when the crash came, demand collapsed. Orders for furniture, boots, books, and tools dwindled as consumers tightened belts. Journeymen who once expected regular wages now wandered from shop to shop, hoping for occasional work. Some took whatever day labor they could find, hauling bricks, digging ditches, tasks that bruised not only their bodies but their pride. Letters and petitions from artisans reveal a deep bitterness. They had believed in the dignity of their crafts, yet the market had reduced them to casual laborers. Unskilled workers fared no better. Dockhands, teamsters, seamstresses, and domestic servants lived in a cycle of temporary hiring and sudden dismissal. One week might bring a modest wage, the next, nothing at all. Employers, emboldened by the surplus of desperate labor, drove wages downward. In New York, reports suggest pay for unskilled workers fell by as much as 30%. For women, already underpaid, the crisis was harsher still. Many seamstresses and washerwomen earned barely enough to buy bread, let alone pay rent. In the bleakness, however, a new awareness began to stir. Workers started to recognize that their struggles were not isolated, but shared. Out of hardship grew the seeds of labor organization. Trade societies, some of which had existed before the Panic, gained urgency as members banded together not just to improve conditions, but simply to survive. Meetings were filled with grievances, employers cutting wages, banks hoarding specie, politicians ignoring the plight of the working class, though still fragmented. These early groups began to articulate ideas that would later fuel the labor movement, ideas about the dignity of work, the injustice of exploitation, and the necessity of solidarity. Strikes, though rare, did occur, even in the depths of depression. In 1837, New York tailors walked out in protest of wage cuts. A bold gesture in a time when many feared losing even the smallest income. The strike failed, crushed by the sheer availability of replacement labor, but it revealed a spirit of resistance. In Philadelphia, groups of journeymen petitioned city leaders for public works projects to provide jobs, an early echo of demands that would grow louder in later decades. The Depression also changed the cultural perception of labor. Middle-class commentators, once quick to dismiss workers' complaints, could not ignore the sheer scale of suffering. Newspapers began publishing sympathetic accounts of unemployed men, women, and children. Reformers argued that unchecked speculation and reckless banking had endangered not just capitalists, but society as a whole. The crisis gave weight to the idea that labor was not simply a commodity, but a human foundation of the Republic. From the vantage point of 2025, these developments feel both distant and familiar. We, too, live in an economy where workers face precarious contracts, sudden layoffs, and downward pressure on wages during downturns. Just as 1837 revealed the imbalance between labor and capital, so do modern recessions expose the fragility of those who rely on wages to survive. And just as early workers found strength in solidarity, so too do contemporary movements, whether through unions, protests, or digital campaigns, seek to amplify voices otherwise drowned by the noise of markets. The Panic of 1837 did not create a fully organized labor movement. That would come later, in the late 19th century, but it planted something vital: the recognition that workers shared common struggles, that their fates were linked, and that collective action, however modest, was necessary. In the silence of shuttered workshops and idle docks, America's working class began, however faintly, to find its voice. And in that voice lay a subtle but profound shift. For while speculation had promised riches to the few, it was labor-hungry, restless, resilient, that reminded the Republic of its true backbone. When the scaffolding of prosperity collapsed in 1837, ordinary Americans did not vanish into despair. They adapted. Survival required invention, and communities across the nation improvised systems that carried them through the long depression. If cash grew scarce, people found other ways to trade. If credit evaporated, they built new forms of trust. Hardship, for all its cruelty, sparked a creativity rooted in necessity. The most immediate adaptation was barter. Families swapped goods and services in arrangements that blurred the line between economy and kinship. A farmer, unable to pay a blacksmith with coin, might offer a bushel of corn or a side of pork. A seamstress might mend a neighbor's clothes in exchange for firewood. In towns and villages, informal markets sprang up, where goods changed hands, not with paper notes, but with promises. These exchanges carried not just value, but dignity, allowing families to survive without charity and reminding communities of the bonds that tied them. Together, another response came in the form of substitute currency. With banks collapsing and specie drained by the specie circular, official money grew scarce. Into the gap stepped merchants, private businesses, and even political activists, who minted small copper coins known as hard times tokens. Some bore advertisements, others political slogans mocking President Van Buren or celebrating hard cider, but all functioned as practical currency in everyday trade. A token stamped with millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute, or "I take the responsibility" might pass from hand to hand in a grocery, a tavern, or a market stall, carrying both economic and political weight. These tokens, often collected by numismatists today, were lifelines, then a tangible sign that the economy, though broken, had not stopped entirely. Communities also leaned heavily on mutual aid. Immigrant societies, church congregations, and neighborhood groups pooled resources to cover rent or provide food. Catholic parishes organized grain distributions for Irish families. German societies collected dues to support members out of work. African American churches, often excluded from broader networks, became crucial centers of resilience, offering not only spiritual guidance but also practical support, food drives, schooling for children, even shared housing. In these spaces, the Depression forged solidarity that would long outlast the crisis. Even leisure adapted to scarcity. With theaters too expensive and luxuries out of reach, families turned inward for entertainment. Storytelling, hymn singing, and home music filled evenings once reserved for public amusements. Diaries describe neighbors gathering by candlelight to share songs or tales, exchanging warmth as much as words. What money could not provide, community did, a sense of belonging. A reminder that even in hardship, life could be endured together. The culture of frugality also deepened. Newspapers carried endless advice columns on stretching meals, repairing garments, and making do with less. Ministers preached sermons on the virtues of thrift, framing the Depression as divine chastisement for greed. Children grew up learning to mend rather than replace, to share rather than hoard. This ethic of restraint, born in scarcity, lingered in the habits of a generation long after recovery came. From the vantage point of 2025, these responses feel almost timeless. In modern recessions, food banks, community exchanges, and even local currencies echo the strategies of 1837. When official systems falter, people return to the oldest forms of economy: trust, barter, and mutual support. Technology may have changed, but the human instinct remains the same: survival through solidarity. The Panic of 1837 thus revealed not only the fragility of paper prosperity, but also the resilience of human communities. In the absence of stable banks, people created tokens. In the absence of wages, they invented barter. In the absence of government aid, they built their own networks of care. The crisis stripped away illusions of endless wealth, but it also revealed a truth more enduring: that even when the scaffolding of markets collapses, society itself can still stand if people choose to hold one another up. Even in times of hunger and hardship, culture does not disappear. It adapts, sometimes darkly, sometimes playfully, to the shape of crisis. After the Panic of 1837, Americans found themselves surrounded by unemployment, poverty, and disappointment. But they also found ways to laugh at misfortune, to mock their leaders, and to turn despair into shared humor. It was not denial, it was survival. For satire and song can often soften blows that bread cannot. Newspapers of the era brimmed with biting caricatures. Martin Van Buren, already saddled with the mocking nickname Van Ruin, became the favorite target. Political cartoons showed him strutting in elegant clothes while families starved in the streets. Others pictured him sipping champagne, indifferent to the cries of children begging for bread. The independent treasury, his major policy initiative, was lampooned as a locked box, filled not with gold but with broken promises. These images were not merely entertainment. They were collective therapy, allowing citizens to voice frustration. Through laughter, popular songs, too, carried the sting of satire. Ballads circulated in taverns and marketplaces, mocking both bankers and politicians. One ditty compared worthless banknotes to autumn leaves, abundant, fragile, and good only for kindling. Another poked fun at land speculators, who once bragged of fortunes but now walked home penniless, their acres no more substantial than the air. Music, accessible to all, gave voice to grievances in ways speeches could not dot. In homes and neighborhoods, humor often emerged as gallows wit. Diaries and letters preserved small jokes. Fathers teasing that they would pay debts with paper cut from newspapers. Mothers quipping that soup was so thin, one could read scripture through it. These were not trivial remarks, but attempts to restore dignity in the face of deprivation. To laugh, even bitterly, was to insist that hardship could not silence the human spirit. Street culture reflected the mood as well. Peddlers sold trinkets mocking worthless currency, and printers produced shin plasters, tiny notes printed as jokes, declaring values like 25 cents and promises, or good for one laugh. Children played games with discarded banknotes, treating them as scraps of paper rather than treasures. The absurdity of financial collapse became woven into daily amusements. At the same time, the crisis inspired serious reflection in literature and sermons. Writers described the panic as a moral lesson, warning against greed and unchecked ambition. Ministers thundered that God had punished the nation for idolatry of wealth, while reformers used the moment to argue for temperance, thrift, and discipline. The Depression, in this moralistic frame, was not only an economic disaster, but also a chance for spiritual renewal. The juxtaposition is striking. Humor and satire on one hand, solemn moralizing on the other, yet both served the same purpose: helping people endure. Culture, in all its forms, gave shape to suffering, turning it into something that could be sung about, laughed at, or preached upon, rather than borne silently. From the perspective of 2025, we recognize the pattern instantly. Economic downturns today produce memes, late-night comedy, satirical cartoons, and social media jokes about inflation or unemployment. Just as in 1837, humor becomes a weapon against despair, a way of reclaiming agency when reality feels uncontrollable. The human instinct to laugh in the face of ruin has not changed. The Panic of 1837, then, was not only an economic or political event, it was also a cultural one. It shaped the songs people sang, the jokes they told, the images they printed, and the lessons they believed. Amid hunger and eviction, laughter still echoed, often bitter but still defiant. And if you are still awake, listening quietly as these voices of long ago murmur through the centuries, perhaps you could leave a simple one in the comments. It's our little signal, half serious, half playful, that even in the darkest times, humor, connection, and endurance remain. By the close of the 1830s, America remained mired in the long shadow of the Panic of 1837, but faint glimmers of recovery began to appear. The collapse had been swift and merciless, yet the process of rebuilding was slow, uneven, and deeply fragile. For ordinary citizens, it felt less like a triumphant rebound and more like the gradual lifting of a heavy fog days of hunger giving way to modest meals. Empty workshops creaking back to life, and markets flickering with cautious activity. One of the first signs of adaptation came from the banking sector itself. After the initial wave of failures, those institutions that survived began rebuilding reserves and tightening their lending practices. The reckless expansion of paper currency slowed, replaced by a more conservative emphasis on specie reserves. Credit, though still scarce, became slowly more stable. Merchants who had once relied on risky loans learned, painfully, to operate with greater caution, and many small banks disappeared altogether, leaving a leaner, if more cautious, system. The federal government, under Van Buren, pressed ahead with the independent treasury system, which, despite fierce opposition, was intended to insulate public funds from private banking collapses. While this reform offered little immediate relief, it laid groundwork for future stability, creating a framework where government revenue was separated from the fragile edifice of speculative lending. Critics saw it as too little, too late, but it marked a step toward rethinking how the young republic managed its finances. Agriculture, too, began to stabilize, though only after deep suffering. Cotton prices, which had collapsed under British pressure, slowly recovered as demand abroad rebounded in the early 1840s. Farmers who had survived foreclosure cautiously resumed planting, and new technologies in tools and transporter and plows. Improved canal routes helped increase efficiency, yet the scars lingered. Many families never regained their lost land, and entire communities had been uprooted by foreclosure. For them, recovery meant migration or reinvention, not restoration. In cities, industries stumbled back to life. Textile mills in New England, which had slowed or shuttered in the late 1830s, gradually reopened. Employers, emboldened by lower wages and surplus labor, rehired cautiously, often under harsher conditions than before. Workers returned, but the lessons of the Depression remained etched in their minds. The humiliation of joblessness had fueled a deeper sense of solidarity, and though recovery restored employment, it did not erase the grievances that had begun to shape early labor consciousness. Trade revived as well. The paralysis of international commerce eased once British markets regained confidence in American exports, and ships once again filled New York's harbor. Merchants cautiously expanded inventories, though the memory of sudden collapse tempered their optimism. Insurance houses and shipping companies recalibrated their models, demanding stricter terms and greater assurances, reshaping the rules of commerce in ways that would define the coming decades. Culturally, recovery was measured less in numbers than in mood. Churches preached gratitude for survival and humility in prosperity. Families who had endured lean years carried forward habits of thrift gardens planted, garments repaired, luxuries foregone. Children who had grown up during the Depression often recalled those years as times of deprivation, but also of resilience, where neighbors shared food and families learned the art of making do. These habits became woven into the national character, shaping how Americans viewed wealth, risk, and endurance long after the crisis passed. From our vantage in 2025, the recovery from 1837 offers familiar lessons. Economic rebounds are rarely swift or even they arrive in uneven waves, leaving some behind even as others surge ahead. Just as today, stock tickers may flash optimism while ordinary families still count coins at the grocery. So too, in 1839 or 1840, newspapers might report a revival, while soup kitchens remained full. Recovery then, as now, was a matter of perspective felt differently by the merchant regaining profits, the banker restoring reserves, and the worker still hunting for a day's wage. And yet, despite the scars, the Republic endured. The Depression revealed vulnerabilities, but it also demonstrated resilience. Banks rebuilt, farmers replanted, merchants retraded, families persevered. The storm had not destroyed the nation, though it had permanently altered its course. The faint light of recovery in the early 1840s did not erase the memory of panic, but it hinted at something Americans never fully lost: a stubborn belief that tomorrow, despite all evidence, might still be better than today. If the panic of 1837 had cast America into shadow, one of the faint lights guiding the way out came from its infrastructure, those ambitious networks of canals, railroads, and turnpikes that bound distant regions together. Even as banks failed and farms were lost, the skeletal frameworks of progress remained, waiting for the economy to breathe life back into them. By the late 1830s and early 1840s, these arteries of commerce became the channels through which recovery slowly flowed. The Erie Canal, completed more than a decade earlier, had already transformed New York into the hub of American trade. During the Depression, its traffic slowed as commerce contracted, but it did not stop. Barges still carried grain, timber, and goods from the western frontier to the Atlantic coast, albeit in smaller quantities. For farmers who managed to cling to their land, the canal remained a lifeline, a means of reaching markets even when prices were low. By 1840, as confidence tentatively returned, the canal system surged once more, helping stabilize agricultural communities battered by years of foreclosure and debt. Railroads, though still in their infancy, offered an even more dramatic glimpse of the future. Before the panic, speculation had fueled a boom in railroad charters, many of which collapsed when credit evaporated. Yet a handful of lines survived, crawling slowly across the landscape. The Baltimore and Ohio, the Boston and Lowell, and the Mohawk and Hudson kept running, demonstrating that steel rails could outpace canals in speed and reliability. As the Depression eased, investment in these surviving lines revived, and new projects cautiously resumed. For many Americans, the sight of a locomotive puffing across the countryside became a symbol of resilience. Even in hardship, progress had not halted entirely. Turnpikes and smaller roads, maintained by local communities, also played a role. While large-scale projects languished for lack of funding, towns invested in modest improvements, recognizing that even in lean years, commerce depended on reliable routes. Wagons still had to roll, crops still had to move, and neighbors still needed markets. These humbler efforts, far from the glamour of canals or railroads, kept the fabric of trade intact. The Depression forced infrastructure projects to adapt. Investors, once dazzled by grand visions, now demanded stricter accountability. Engineers sought cheaper, more efficient designs. States, burned by debts from overambitious canal projects, became more cautious, balancing ambition with fiscal restraint. Yet in this tension lay a peculiar strength. The projects that survived were sturdier, more carefully managed, and more enduring than the speculative fantasies that had collapsed in the panic. Domestic commerce slowly revived along these channels. Grain from the Midwest, timber from upstate New York, cotton from the South all found their way back into circulation through ports, canals, and rails. Merchants in Philadelphia and New York, once paralyzed by bankruptcies, cautiously reopened. Warehouses, small manufacturers, especially in textiles and tools, benefited from the improved flow of goods. By the early 1840s, though hardship persisted, the rhythm of trade was audible again, faint but steady. For ordinary people, these shifts mattered deeply. A farmer who could send surplus grain by canal might survive another season. A worker hired to lay track on a new rail line might feed his family through the winter. Infrastructure was not merely a symbol of national progress. It was the daily bread of recovery. Communities clung to these projects as proof that the Republic still had a future worth building. From the perspective of 2025, the story resonates strongly. In modern recessions, governments often turn to infrastructure spending as a way to revive economies, employing workers, stimulating demand, and laying the groundwork for long-term growth. The principle was no different in the 1830s and 1840s, though the scale and technology were humbler. A canal dug by hand, a rail laid by muscle, a turnpike paved with sweatage, carried the same promise that investment and movement could restore a stagnant economy. The recovery, however, was uneven. Some regions thrived, others languished. The North, with its canals and growing railroads, found steadier footing than the South, where reliance on cotton left communities at the mercy of volatile global markets. Still, the message was clear. Infrastructure was resilience. Amid collapse, it provided both practical relief and symbolic hope, reminding Americans that the nation's destiny was still being built, mile by mile, stone by stone, rail by rail. The Panic of 1837 had shown how fragile prosperity could be. But in its aftermath, the slow pulse of canals and the steady clatter of locomotives hinted at renewal. Progress had been wounded, not killed, and though recovery was fragile, it moved forward along the very tracks and waterways that had once symbolized boundless expansion. When the Panic of 1837 struck, it revealed with brutal clarity how deeply America's prosperity depended on the wider world. Cotton, timber, wheat, and tobacco, all the lifeblood of the Republic, flowed outward across the Atlantic, while credit, specie, and manufactured goods flowed back in. The collapse of this exchange had crippled both sides, but as the 1840s began, the cords of international commerce were tied again, reshaped by necessity and tempered by caution. Britain remained the pivot. Its factories in Manchester, Leeds, and Liverpool depended on American cotton, and no depression could permanently sever that demand. By the early 1840s, British credit once again trickled across the Atlantic, though with stricter terms. London bankers, burned by the reckless excesses of American speculation, now demanded higher security and steadier guarantees. The flood of cheap money that had fueled the land bubble was gone. In its place came narrower, more disciplined channels of capital. For American merchants, this meant slower growth, but also greater stability. Cotton exports gradually revived, bringing relief. To the South, planters, who had watched prices collapse in the late 1830s, now saw bales moving once more through New Orleans and Charleston, bound for English mills. Yet the rebound carried a lesson. Dependence on a single crop tied the South's fate to forces beyond its control. A downturn in Britain could still throw thousands of Americans into despair. The fragility of this system, though not fully reckoned with at the time, foreshadowed the vulnerabilities that would haunt the South for decades. The North and Midwest, meanwhile, began to diversify. wheat from Ohio and Illinois, lumber from Michigan and Wisconsin, and pork from Kentucky found markets abroad, especially in Britain, where rapid urbanization created insatiable demand for food and raw materials. American grain-fed English workers, just as English credit fueled American trade. The transatlantic bond tightened, less as an affair of speculation and more as a partnership of necessity. This rebalancing gave the United States a new stature in the global economy. Once viewed as a reckless debtor nation, prone to speculative frenzy, America began to emerge as a reliable supplier of staples. Its population growth, expanding farms, and tentative industrial base suggested a market that European traders could not ignore, though the scars of 1837 lingered. The 1840s marked the beginning of America's transition from fragile frontier republic to rising economic power. Culturally, the revival of trade restored confidence. Ships once again crowded New York's harbor, their masts a forest against the skyline. Newspapers reported cautiously optimistic figures on exports and imports, though they also warned of over-reliance on British credit. Merchants celebrated the return of goods from Europe, cloth books, tool symbols, not only of prosperity, but of reconnection with the wider world. Yet beneath the optimism lay caution. American leaders debated whether dependence on foreign capital was a blessing or a trap. Van Buren's critics argued that his policies had left the nation vulnerable to London's decisions, while his supporters insisted that tighter discipline was necessary to prevent another speculative collapse. In taverns and town halls, ordinary citizens repeated a simpler version of the debate. Could America truly stand on its own, or was it always bound to the fate of Britain? From our vantage in 2025, the dynamic feels familiar. Today, America debates its economic ties to global markets, worrying about dependence on foreign capital, supply chains, or overseas demand. The questions echo those of the 1840s. How much autonomy can a nation truly claim in a world where commerce binds economies together? Just as Britain once held the key to America's cotton fortunes, so too do modern powers influence today's markets with decisions made far beyond American shores. Still, recovery was real. By 1843, the worst of the Depression had passed. Exports flowed steadily, credit cautiously returned, and Americans once more looked outward with ambition. The memory of 1837 lingered, but the nation had survived its first great lesson in the interdependence of economies. It emerged bruised but wiser, more aware that prosperity was not born within borders alone, but woven into the fabric of global trade. And so, the panic of 1837 left behind not only scars, but also a new role for America. Not merely a reckless gambler in land and credit, but a participant still young, still fragile in the great game of international commerce. It was a role the nation would only grow into, with consequences far beyond what its citizens could then imagine. One of the clearest lessons of the panic of 1837 was the fragility of paper promises. Americans who had once trusted banknotes found themselves holding slips of ink that could not be redeemed. Confidence, once abundant, evaporated in days. Out of this trauma grew a renewed obsession with hard money, gold and silver, tangible wealth that could not vanish with the stroke of a pen. The debate was not new. Since the founding of the Republic, Americans had argued over currency. Should it be anchored in specie, or could paper suffice so long as confidence held? Jackson himself had taken a hard money stance, distrusting banks and insisting that gold and silver alone provided honest value. His specie circular of 1836, however disastrous in timing, had reflected this conviction. After the panic, even critics of Jackson's policies found themselves leaning toward his suspicion of paper. Banks adjusted quickly. Survivors of the crisis reduced their reliance on unsecured notes and sought to maintain larger reserves of specie. This meant credit was scarcer, loans harder to secure, and expansion slower. But it also meant the system, though stiffer, was less likely to collapse under the same pressures. Ordinary citizens, too, began to demand payments in coin whenever possible. In shops and markets, silver dollars and gold eagles regained prestige, their metallic ring carrying a reassurance that paper could no longer provide. The federal government's embrace of the independent treasury in 1840 further reflected this shift. By storing public funds in government vaults rather than depositing them in private banks, Van Buren's policy sought to protect the nation from reckless lending. The independent treasury required that government transactions be conducted in specie, reinforcing the hard money ethos. While unpopular at first, it restricted credit and offered little relief to borrowers. It established a precedent for tighter fiscal discipline. Specie itself became a symbol of stability. Gold from southern mines and silver from western territories trickled into circulation, though never in quantities sufficient to meet demand. Merchants hoarded coins, farmers treasured them, and workers cherished wages paid in metal. The scarcity of hard money made it all the more valued, creating a paradox: stability at the cost of liquidity. This fixation on specie also carried cultural overtones. In sermons and editorials, hard money was linked to honesty, virtue, and restraint, while paper money symbolized greed, speculation, and deceit. The panic had moralized the currency debate. To many Americans, the very sound of coins striking together was a reminder of integrity. Paper, by contrast, whispered of betrayal. From a broader perspective, the specie discipline slowed recovery. With less credit available, businesses struggled to expand, and ordinary families found it harder to borrow. Yet it also tempered speculation, preventing another reckless surge. The pendulum had swung from excess to austerity, and though painful, this swing was seen by many as necessary. Looking from 2025, the echoes are unmistakable. In times of crisis, modern societies still retreat to what they deem safe. Investors flee stocks for gold, governments tighten fiscal policy, and the public clings to tangible assets. Cryptocurrencies, touted as the new hard money, rise and fall on similar tides of belief and suspicion. The pattern is ancient. When paper trust collapses, people reach instinctively for metal ore, for something they imagine cannot be debased. The Panic of 1837 thus reshaped America's monetary culture. It did not end the debate between paper and specie, but it tipped the balance decisively toward caution. For decades after, the cry for hard money remained a powerful force in American politics, shaping not only economic policy, but also the very language of morality and trust. By the early 1840s, as recovery gained strength, the coin once again jingled in markets, and banknotes, though still used, were treated with greater suspicion. America had learned, at great cost, that prosperity built on promises alone could vanish overnight. Gold and silver, scarce and stubborn, had become not just currency, but symbols of survival. Recovery from the Panic of 1837 was never simply an economic affair. It was a political crucible. Every downturn leaves behind not only empty purses, but also bitter memories, and those memories inevitably become weapons in the contests of power. For Martin Van Buren, the years of slow revival proved to be less a vindication of his policies than a steady erosion of his authority. While for the Whig Party, the scars of the Depression became fertile soil for victory. Van Buren's philosophy of limited government, embodied most clearly in his independent treasury system, was consistent with Jacksonian principles. He argued that the federal government must avoid entanglement with private banks, that public funds must be protected from speculation, and that the economy must heal itself. Yet to the millions of Americans enduring hunger, unemployment, and foreclosure, such principles felt like cold abstractions. They wanted bread, not fiscal theory. When wages failed to recover quickly and credit remained scarce, the president's restraint was cast as aloofness. His nickname Van Ruin echoed relentlessly in newspapers, taverns, and campaign speeches. The Whigs seized the moment with theatrical flair. They understood that politics in hard times was not won with policy detail, but with imagery. They painted Van Buren as a pampered aristocrat, a man of polished manners and fine taste, indifferent to the suffering of common folk. Against this image, they set William Henry Harrison, a war hero of humble origins, supposedly living in a log cabin and drinking hard cider. The contrast was more myth than reality. Harrison was wealthy and well-connected, but it resonated. The log cabin and cider became icons of the 1840 campaign, splashed across banners, badges, and songs. The election of 1840 thus became one of the first truly modern political spectacles. Parades filled with floats shaped like log cabins, barrels of cider handed out at rallies, campaign songs sung late into the night. For a nation still licking its wounds from economic collapse, the Whigs offered not policy nuance, but a story. The common man rising against the aloof elite. It was, in many ways, a cultural performance, tapping directly into the frustrations bred by years of depression. Van Buren could not compete with the theater. His arguments for the independent treasury, for fiscal prudence, for discipline sound in theory could not match the emotional appeal of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Voters, weary of suffering and eager for change, swept Harrison into office in a landslide, though Harrison would die only a month into his presidency. The political message was unmistakable. Economic pain translates into political punishment, and memory of hardship endures long after statistics improve. The Panic of 1837 thus reshaped the nation's politics as much as its economy. It elevated the Whigs, proved the potency of populist imagery, and cemented the idea that presidents would be judged less by their philosophies than by the material fortunes of ordinary citizens. It also revealed the danger of governing with restraint in an age of mass democracy, when bread is scarce. Theory has little appeal. From the perspective of 2025, the parallels are clear. Leaders today face the same dilemma. Should they pursue long-term fiscal discipline or immediate relief? Should they trust markets to recover on their own, or intervene boldly at the risk of distortion? And just as in 1840, political fortunes often rise or fall, not on the success of policy, but on the perception of empathy or its absence. A slogan, an image, a story can outweigh years of cautious governance. In the end, Van Buren became a casualty of the panic's lingering memory, while the Whigs enjoyed their first great triumph. The Depression had not only scarred households and communities, but had also rewritten the script of American politics. Economic collapse had translated into cultural performance, and culture had delivered power. And if you are still with me, following these threads of ruin and recovery, politics and performance, leave a quiet one in the comments. It is our subtle nod across centuries, a way of saying that even in the long night of history, you are awake with me. Every great crisis leaves behind two kinds of legacy, one measured in numbers, and another etched in memory. The Panic of 1837 was no different. By the early 1840s, as the worst of the Depression eased and new rhythms of recovery emerged, the scars remained vivid in the minds of those who had lived through the collapse. Families carried forward not only the burden of lost savings or land, but also a transformed sense of trust, caution, and expectation. These intangible legacies shaped the behavior of a generation long after the statistics of recovery suggested prosperity had returned. For many, the first enduring lesson was suspicion. The easy credit and soaring optimism of the early 1830s had promised wealth for all. But when the crash came, those promises dissolved into hunger. Ordinary workers who had never speculated nonetheless lost jobs, homes, or security. In their I's paper money became a symbol of betrayal. Coins, gold and silver, were cherished not merely for their material worth, but as anchors of certainty in a world of shifting promises. Parents taught children to distrust banks, to value thrift, and to measure wealth in tangible goods. A cow in the barn, a sack of flour, a coin tucked safely away were lessons born of loss. The second legacy was restraint, where the 1830s had celebrated bold expansion and speculation. The post-crisis years cultivated caution. Farmers thought twice before mortgaging land, merchants before extending credit, artisans before taking loans for new equipment. Diaries and letters from the 1840s reveal a quiet refrain: "We will not be caught again." Even as the economy revived, a culture of thrift lingered. Homes repaired rather than rebuilt, meals stretched rather than indulged, luxuries postponed until absolutely secure. Children raised in this environment absorbed habits of frugality that would shape their adulthood. There was also a legacy of politics. Families who had cursed Van Buren's name over empty tables did not forget. The bitterness fueled conversations at taverns and family gatherings, shaping party loyalties for years to come. In many communities, the Whigs found loyal supporters, not because of ideology, but because they had promised change during years of hunger. Even decades later, when the Democratic Party regained strength, the memory of 1837 haunted their reputation. Political culture, like family culture, carries its scars forward. At the communal level, the panic left behind traditions of mutual aid. Churches that had expanded their charitable missions during the Depression did not abandon them afterward. Mutual aid societies, born in desperation, became permanent fixtures of immigrant communities. African American congregations, which had supported members during the darkest years, grew stronger, their roles as cultural and economic anchors firmly cemented. Out of necessity, new habits of solidarity had taken root, and they endured even after prosperity returned. From our perspective in 2025, the durability of such memories is easy to understand. Modern recessions, whether in 2008 or during the pandemic of 2020, produced similar generational imprints. Those who lost homes in foreclosure, or who endured months of unemployment, often carry forward habits of caution. Children who watched parents struggle learn thrift instinctively. The echoes of 1837 remind us that economic trauma does not end with recovery. It reshapes attitudes for decades, sometimes centuries. The Panic of 1837 thus became more than an episode in economic history. It became a story told within families, a quiet warning passed from parents to children. A farmer might point to a foreclosed field and tell his son, "Never trust paper more than soil." A mother might teach her daughter to mend clothes carefully, recalling winters when new fabric was beyond reach. These were not abstract theories of political economy. They were intimate lessons, woven into daily life. And so, the long-term legacy of the Panic was not simply the independent treasury, or the rise of the Whigs, or the recalibration of trade. It was the shaping of a generation's mind, more cautious, more skeptical, more aware of fragility. America would go on to endure many more crises. The depressions of the 1870s and 1890s, the Great Depression of the 1930s, but in each, the memory of earlier traumas whispered warnings. History became not only the story of cycles, but also the inheritance of scars. The Panic of 1837 taught Americans that prosperity could vanish, that speculation had costs, and that survival depended as much on character and caution as on opportunity. It was a bitter lesson, but one that would live in memory long after the figures of commerce had recovered. For immigrant and working-class communities, the Panic of 1837 was not just a moment of hardship. It was a formative experience, a crucible that forged collective memory and reshaped identity. To arrive in America during those years was to encounter a nation that promised abundance, yet delivered scarcity. A land of opportunity that suddenly withheld opportunity at the very gates. For those who survived, the lessons of endurance and solidarity became central to their stories, shaping how they understood not only themselves, but also their place in American society. The Irish, whose numbers swelled in the 1830s and 1840s, carried perhaps the heaviest imprint. Many had fled poverty and famine at home, only to discover poverty again in America's cities. The Depression threw them into cellars and tenements, where hunger gnawed at daily life. Yet within this suffering, Irish communities deepened their bonds. Parish churches became not only spiritual centers, but also hubs of survival, distributing bread, clothing, and comfort. Families learned to rely on one another, pooling pennies to pay rent or sharing scraps of food. Out of this adversity grew the solidarity that would later fuel Irish political machines in cities like New York organizations, built on the memory of having survived together when the nation seemed indifferent. German immigrants, too, drew lessons from the panic. Skilled artisans who once hoped to prosper through craft found themselves displaced into day labor or unemployment. Their disappointment was profound, but their response was organizational. German societies, clubs, and aid associations grew stronger. In the wake of the Depression, determined to protect their members from the humiliation of destitution. These institutions preserved culture, language, traditions, festivals, but they also provided safety nets, from sickness funds to burial support. The crisis had revealed the fragility of individual survival, and so Germans turned to community structure, building networks that would sustain them for generations. African American communities, already marginalized, carried an even sharper memory. Discrimination had excluded them from many trades, and the Depression made prejudice harsher still. Black workers were often the first fired and the last rehired. Yet in this adversity, African American churches rose as pillars of resilience. Congregations organized schools for children, food relief for families, and mutual aid societies for widows and the elderly. Out of necessity grew institutions that not only helped survival in the 1830s, but also laid foundations for the long struggle towards civil rights. The panic reinforced a bitter truth that mainstream society would abandon them in crisis, but it also forged a tradition of self-reliance and solidarity that became an enduring legacy. For the working class at large, the memory of 1837 lingered in attitudes toward employers and government. Laborers had learned how quickly wages could vanish, how indifferent elites could appear, and how fragile their security truly was. This shared experience planted seeds of skepticism and solidarity. Workers became more inclined to join trade associations, to attend meetings, to petition city leaders. Though still fragmented, the nascent labor movement drew strength from the Depression's memory, using it as proof that collective voices were necessary against the indifference of power. These legacies were not abstract. They appeared in family stories, in neighborhood lore, in the way communities raised their children. An Irish father might tell his son about the winter they survived on potatoes alone. A German mother might remind her daughter how neighbors pooled coins to save a sick child. An African American preacher might thunder from the pulpit about how the community had endured when no one else came to their aid. These stories became part of identity, woven into cultural memory as lessons of caution, solidarity, and resilience. From our vantage in 2025, these echoes still resonate. Immigrant communities today, like those of the 1830s, often endure disproportionate hardship in economic downturns. They respond with the same instincts, building networks, creating mutual aid, turning shared suffering into shared strength. Food pantries, cultural associations, and grassroots organizations echo the parish halls, German clubs, and black churches of nearly 2 centuries ago. Memory may fade, but the pattern endures. The Panic of 1837 thus left more than economic scars. It created cultural DNA. It shaped how Irish Americans organized politically, how German immigrants structured community life, how African Americans built institutions of resilience, and how workers across trades began to imagine solidarity. These were not just responses to a crisis. They were legacies, shaping American society long after the panic itself was over. For the communities who endured it, the Depression became a story not only of loss but of survival, told again and again, as proof that they had faced the fire and lived. And in that telling, their children and grandchildren inherited both caution and strength, an inheritance that still shapes America's fabric today. For merchants, bankers, and entrepreneurs, the Panic of 1837 was more than an economic downturn. It was a searing lesson about risk, confidence, and the fragile machinery of credit. Unlike the working poor, who bore the blunt edge of unemployment and hunger, the financial elite experienced the panic as a direct rebuke to their ambitions. Many had believed they were masters of prosperity, only to discover they were servants of forces beyond their control. The memory of that discovery lingered, altering their practices and shaping the culture of American business for years to come. In the boom years before 1837, speculation had seemed almost patriotic. To invest in land, in canals, in railroads, was to believe in the nation's destiny. Merchants extended credit liberally, bankers issued notes as freely as breath, and entrepreneurs spoke confidently of endless horizons. The panic shattered that illusion overnight. Paper promises collapsed into insolvency, and once proud businessmen saw reputations ruined as quickly as fortunes. The bankruptcy rolls of the late 1830s read like a catalog of shattered dreams. Shopkeepers, shipping magnates, speculators, all swept away. Those who survived adjusted their behavior sharply. Banks, chastened by failure, tightened their practices. They insisted on larger specie reserves, scrutinized borrowers more closely, and demanded higher collateral. The reckless flood of paper that had fueled the land boom gave way to a culture of restraint. Credit did not vanish, but it became harder to secure, and entrepreneurs learned to build with slower, sturdier foundations. Some historians have described the 1840s as an era of sober business, in which the exuberant speculation of the Jackson years was replaced by cautious pragmatism. Merchants, too, redefined their approach. Many who had once relied on British credit or speculative ventures turned toward smaller, steadier operations. Wholesale traders preferred shorter contracts. Shopkeepers built up inventories gradually. Risk was not abandoned. Commerce always involves gamble, but it was approached with a more skeptical eye. The phrase "Remember 37" became a shorthand warning in mercantile circles, invoked whenever a partner proposed a venture that seemed too bold, too optimistic, or too dependent on easy credit. Entrepreneurs of infrastructure, the builders of canals and railroads, also carried scars. The land bubble had collapsed alongside a wave of overambitious projects, leaving states like Pennsylvania drowning in debt. Those who returned to the field in the 1840s did so with stricter plans, insisting on clearer revenue streams and firmer guarantees. Investors, once dazzled by grand visions, demanded evidence, not only dreams. The speculative mania had sobered, and though progress continued, it moved on narrower rails. The panic also reshaped the culture of finance itself. Banks and merchants began to view reputation not merely as a matter of honor, but as a form of collateral. A man's name once a flourish on a note was no longer enough. Trust had to be proven through endurance, through years of steadiness, through visible reserves. The collapse had revealed how fragile words could be, and so business culture shifted toward transparency, accountability, and demonstrable solidity. This new prudence carried costs. Innovation slowed, expansion hesitated, and some opportunities were lost. But it also provided stability, allowing the nation to rebuild without immediately plunging into another speculative frenzy. The scars of 1837 served as brakes on ambition, restraining a culture that had once rushed headlong into risk. From our vantage in 2025, the echoes are sharp. After the crash of 2008, financial institutions imposed stricter lending standards. Investors demanded clearer oversight, and the memory of reckless speculation haunted decisions for more than a decade, just as 19th century merchants invoked Remember 37. So too did 21st century bankers murmur Remember 2008 in boardrooms. The rhythm of panic, memory, and restraint is timeless, yet memory fades. By the 1850s, a new generation of Americans, unscarred by the panic, would once again chase land, railroads, and dreams with reckless abandon, leading, inevitably, to new crashes. But for those who lived through 1837, the lessons were indelible. They knew the sound of bank doors slamming shut, the sight of merchants begging creditors for mercy, the humiliation of promises that dissolved into worthless paper. For them, business was no longer just ambition, it was vigilance. The panic of 1837 had taught them that prosperity was not guaranteed, that credit was as fragile as trust, and that one bad harvest in the Mississippi Valley, or one decision in London, could unravel fortunes across an entire continent. That knowledge hardened them, disciplined them, and in its own way, prepared America for the more complex financial storms that lay ahead. The panic of 1837 did more than empty wallets, it reshaped the very way Americans thought about the relationship between government, markets, and society. Before the crash, confidence in expansion seemed almost boundless. The soil was infinite, credit plentiful, and speculation nearly patriotic. But when the bubble burst, the young republic was forced to ask questions that still echo today. How far should government go to protect citizens from economic ruin? Should markets be trusted to correct themselves, or should Washington intervene? Martin Van Buren's response was clear. He clung to the Jacksonian creed of limited government, resisting calls for bailouts or direct relief. His independent treasury system, which separated federal funds from private banks, embodied a philosophy of restraint. Government must not meddle in the economy, for intervention would only deepen corruption. To Van Buren and his allies, the panic was the painful but natural correction of speculative excess, and citizens had to endure hardship as part of the cycle. But for many Americans, this sounded less like principle and more like abandonment. Hungry families, unemployed workers, and bankrupt farmers wondered why their government stood idle while they suffered. Petitions poured into Congress, demanding public works programs, debt relief, or assistance for the jobless. Though most were denied, the petitions themselves testified to a cultural shift. The expectation that government bore some responsibility for the welfare of its people was beginning to take root. The Whigs capitalized on this sentiment. They argued that government should play a more active role in fostering stability and progress through support for banks, investments in infrastructure, and policies to encourage commerce. In their rhetoric, the state was not an enemy, but a partner in prosperity. The log cabin and hard cider imagery of 1840 might have been populist theater, but beneath it lay a serious ideological challenge, a rejection of Van Buren's hands-off philosophy in favor of a vision where government steered growth. This tension between laissez-faire restraint and activist intervention became one of the defining debates of American political culture. The Panic of 1837 etched it into public consciousness, giving both sides ammunition. For decades afterward, Democrats pointed to the dangers of speculation and corruption whenever government grew too close to banks or corporations. Whigs, and later Republicans, invoked the memory of Van Ruin as proof that inaction could be just as dangerous as excess. Even in cultural life, the debate took root. Ministers thundered about the moral dangers of greed, aligning with hard-money Democrats, who saw the crisis as punishment for excess. Meanwhile, reformers and writers sympathetic to the working class argued that government had a duty to temper the cruelty of markets. Newspapers carried arguments that looked remarkably modern. Should Washington provide jobs when markets fail? Should it regulate banks to prevent collapse? Or should it trust in the discipline of failure to weed out weakness? From the vantage of 2025, the parallels are striking. In our time, debates over government stimulus, central bank policies, and regulation of markets replay the same themes. Advocates of free markets warn against distortion and corruption. Advocates of intervention insist that without action, ordinary citizens bear unbearable costs. The arguments of 1837 remain alive, reframed for new circumstances, but rooted in the same fundamental tension. What the Panic of 1837 revealed most clearly was the fragility of consensus. Americans had celebrated growth when it seemed endless, but once the collapse came, unity dissolved into bitter dispute. Was the crisis the fault of reckless banks, misguided government, or foreign interference? Was recovery to be achieved through discipline or through aid? These questions did not vanish with the Depression's end. They became part of the national conversation, resurfacing in every subsequent downturn. In this way, the Panic helped shape the American creed, not as a single answer, but as a perpetual argument. The United States would forever wrestle with the balance between freedom and protection, between risk and security, between trust in markets and faith in government. The scars of 1837 ensured that no generation could take prosperity for granted without also remembering its fragility. And so, the legacy of the Panic was not merely economic or political, but philosophical. It forced a young nation to look inward, to confront the limits of optimism, and to define, however uneasily, the responsibilities of a republic in times of crisis. That debate, born in breadlines and bankruptcies, still murmurs beneath our own headlines nearly 2 centuries later. By the time the economy began to stabilize in the early 1840s, the Panic of 1837 had already carved itself into the nation's memory. It was not remembered simply as a financial event, nor merely as the collapse of land speculation, but as a cautionary tale etched into the American imagination. Generations afterward would look back on it as one of the Republic's first great reckonings with the dangers of excess, the fragility of confidence, and the human cost of collapse. The legacy of the Panic was multifaceted. For families, it lived in habits of thrift, in the way mothers saved scraps of cloth, fathers hoarded coins, and children grew up wary of debt. For workers, it lived in the early stirrings of solidarity, in trade societies that whispered of rights and dignity. For immigrants in marginalized communities, it lived in the institutions of survival they built when society turned its back. Churches, aid societies, neighborhood networks. For merchants and bankers, it lived in an instinctive caution, a wariness of reckless expansion, and a mantra of remember 37 whenever ambition grew too bold. But the deepest legacy was cultural. The Panic reminded Americans that prosperity was not inevitable, that speculation was not the same as growth, and that the Republic itself was vulnerable to cycles of hope and despair. This realization was humbling. It stripped away the myth of endless expansion and forced the nation to confront limits of credit, of land, of confidence. Yet at the same time, it revealed endurance, the ability of communities to adapt, of families to survive, and of the Republic to rebuild. Historians have often described 1837 as America's first Great Depression, and in that title lies its most enduring lesson. It set a pattern: boom, collapse, recovery, and memory. Each subsequent crisis, the Panics of 1857, 1873, 1893. The Great Depression of the 1930s would echo the rhythms of 1837, each reminding a new generation of truths their grandparents had already learned. The details differed, but the warning was the same. When optimism turns to mania, collapse is never far behind. From our vantage in 2025, this cycle feels painfully familiar. We live in a world where markets surge on enthusiasm, where credit expands beyond reason, where new technologies or assets are hailed as untouchable. Suddenly, they are not. The echoes of 1837 whisper that no bubble is permanent, that no promise is beyond question, and that the cost of collapse is always borne most heavily by the ordinary, the vulnerable, the unseen. And yet, the story of 1837 is not only one of ruin, it is also a story of endurance. Out of panic came reform, out of hardship came solidarity, out of collapse came resilience. The scars became warnings, but also sources of strength. To remember 37 was not only to fear speculation, it was also to trust in the stubborn capacity of Americans to endure. This is why the panic of 1837 lingers as more than a chapter in economic history. It is a mirror, reflecting back to us the fragility of prosperity and the resilience of society. It tells us that collapse is always possible, but so too is survival. It reminds us that while leaders may falter and markets may fail, communities can still hold together, and endurance itself becomes a form of victory. So as we close this chapter of the story, let the memory of 1837 remain not only as a warning, but as a testament. A warning that speculation is never free of consequence, and a testament that endurance is stronger than despair. And if you are still awake, with me still listening, still tracing these echoes across centuries, leave a simple one in the comments. It is our quiet acknowledgement that the story of the past still speaks to the present, and that we too carry its lessons forward. History, when told as a string of dates and figures, can feel distant, almost inert. But when we listen closely, when we sit with it in the quiet hours of the night, history ceases to be a skeleton of facts and becomes a living echo, a voice, carried forward through time. The panic of 1837 is one such echo. At first glance, it is a financial event, a tangle of banking policy, land speculation, and transatlantic trade. Yet beneath that, it is a human story, rich with hunger, resilience, betrayal, and survival. To trace its arc is to move not only through the collapse of markets, but through the kitchens of the poor, the pulpits of preachers, the songs of taverns, the speeches of politicians, and the cautious whispers of merchants who had once believed prosperity eternal. As we stand in 2025, nearly 2 centuries later, the story feels strangely alive. In the headlines, we hear debates about inflation, about the role of central banks, about the risks of speculative bubbles in housing or digital assets. In conversations at dinner tables, we hear worries about unemployment, about rising prices, about whether promises of prosperity will truly reach ordinary families. These are not new anxieties. They are the very same questions Americans asked in 1837, dressed in new vocabulary, reframed by modern circumstances, but identical in their essence. The panic of 1837 began with confidence and abundance of it. A flood of optimism so thick it drowned out caution. Land seemed infinite, credit limitless, expansion unstoppable. The Republic, still young, believed it had inherited destiny itself. But as confidence inflated, so too did fragility. Easy loans, speculative purchases, reckless banking all masked by the illusion that tomorrow would always be richer than today. And then came the shock. Jackson's Specie Circular, Britain's demand for gold and silver, crop failures, a sudden contraction of credit. The bubble, stretched to transparency, burst. The collapse that followed revealed truths that Americans did not wish to face, that prosperity could vanish overnight, that paper promises were only as good as the confidence behind them, that the poor and the vulnerable always bore the heaviest weight of collapse. Families lost homes, immigrants starved in cellars, workers queued for bread, and banks closed their doors with cold finality. The Republic endured its first Great Depression, and in that endurance, it was forever changed. Yet even in the bleakest days, resilience glimmered. Families bartered, neighbors shared, churches fed, and communities built mutual aid. Workers, once silent, began to speak in collective voice. Immigrant groups, hardened by hunger, learned solidarity that would later fuel political power. Merchants and bankers, chastened, reined in their recklessness and rebuilt with greater caution. Out of collapse grew memory, and out of memory grew wisdom, though often temporary. For each generation must relearn what its predecessors tried to pass on. The legacies of 1837 are still with us, the caution toward speculation, the debates over government's role, the instinct to hoard coins or gold in times of fear, the mistrust of paper promises. All these linger in our political and cultural DNA. They surface whenever markets shake, whenever trust falters, whenever the word panic appears once more in headlines. And they remind us that prosperity is not a straight line, but a rhythm, one that alternates between confidence and collapse, despair and recovery. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of 1837 is not the fragility of wealth, but the resilience of people. The Republic did not crumble. Its families endured hunger, yes, but they also endured together. Its workers lost jobs, yes, but they also found solidarity. Its merchants lost fortunes, but they rebuilt with steadier hands. Out of ruin came not just survival, but renewal. It is tempting, in our own age, to believe we are unique, to think that cryptocurrency crashes, housing crises, pandemics, or inflation are entirely new phenomena, challenges no one before us has faced. But history insists otherwise. Our anxieties are old. Our struggles are inherited. The panic of 1837 whispers that others, too, feared the collapse of their world. That others, too, lay awake at night worrying about work, rent, food, and survival. And just as they endured, so too can we. The question is not whether collapse will come again. History suggests it always does, but how we will respond when it does. Will we turn on one another, or turn toward one another? Will we forget the lessons of the past, or carry them forward? Will we chase speculation blindly, or temper ambition with wisdom? These are questions no government, no bank, no market can answer alone. They are questions for us, as citizens, as neighbors, as families. And perhaps that is why stories like 1837 matter. They are not bedtime tales meant simply to soothe. They are mirrors, reflecting our own uncertainties in the flicker of history's candlelight. They remind us that despair is never final, that recovery is possible, and that resilience, though quiet, is stronger than ruin. As we close tonight's journey, think of the families who patched clothes by candlelight, the laborers who stood in bread lines, the immigrants who clung to parish halls, the merchants who whispered, "Remember 37," before signing another note. Think of how their endurance, humble and unsung, carried the Republic forward. And think of how our own endurance, in this restless year of 2025, is part of the same story, unbroken thread of survival stretching across centuries. If this story has kept you company tonight, if it has given you both caution and comfort, I invite you to carry it forward. Leave a comment, even just a quiet one, to let me know you are awake with me in this long conversation across time. And if you wish for more journeys like this, more echoes of the past, to guide our uncertain present, consider subscribing, leaving a like, or sharing this story with someone who, like you, may find peace in history's whisper. For history is never only about the past. It is about us, here, now, breathing the same anxieties, searching for the same reassurances, needing the same hope. The panic of 1837 is gone, but its lessons remain. And as long as we remember, we are never truly alone in our struggles. So let the memory of 1837 rest with you tonight, not as a tale of despair, but as a gentle reminder that collapse is not the end, and that endurance is always possible. Tomorrow will come, as it always has, and with it, the chance to rebuild, to renew, and to hope.